The doorbell chimed softly as Mrs. Rose stepped into the charming bistro, a place that held years of memories. The warm scent of baked bread and roasted herbs filled the air, just as it always had. This restaurant had been her sanctuary, a place where birthdays were celebrated, anniversaries toasted, and quiet afternoons spent in peaceful solitude. But today, something felt different. There was a shift in the air, an unfamiliar stiffness. The usual warmth seemed muted, replaced by a lingering tension that she couldn't quite place. The clinking of silverware and hushed conversations continued, yet there was a sense of detachment. The place was busy, but not chaotic. Something else was off. As she moved toward the front counter, her eyes scanned the room. The staff bustled about, but there were new faces among them. A young waiter stood behind the counter, his posture rigid, his brow furrowed. His presence felt starkly out of place, not because he was new, but because of the air of impatience he carried, like he had no desire to be there. Mrs. Rose offered a small, polite smile as she approached. Her voice was gentle, warm, but before she could finish speaking, the waiter barely glanced up, his fingers tapping against the notepad in his hand. His response was flat, dismissive. She hesitated. The response was unexpected, unkind. She had confirmed her reservation just the day before. This had never happened before. But the waiter didn't check the system, didn't ask for details. He just wanted her gone. The sharpness of his tone didn't go unnoticed. A few nearby diners exchanged glances. A woman at a corner table whispered to her companion, her eyes lingering on the scene. Mrs. Rose inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She had spent a lifetime brushing off moments like this. The quiet exclusions, the subtle dismissals, the unspoken message that she wasn't welcome. But today, on her birthday, in this place, it cut deeper. And yet, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply stood, waiting. But the waiter didn't waver. He sighed, louder this time, crossing his arms. His irritation was palpable now. It wasn't just about the table. He saw her as an inconvenience, an expectation he didn't feel like meeting. Then, a murmur from the other side of the room. Someone recognized her. Someone remembered. The whisper spread. The mood in the restaurant shifted, but the young waiter still hadn't noticed. He didn't know who she was, and he had no idea what was coming next. The silence stretched between them, thick and uneasy. Mrs. Rose remained composed, but something in her eyes changed. A quiet determination settling in. She wasn't going to be dismissed so easily. More whispers stirred in the restaurant. A few patrons had stopped mid-conversation, their attention drawn to the scene unfolding at the counter. The weight of unseen eyes pressed upon the young waiter, but he either didn't notice or didn't care. Mrs. Rose, her voice still calm, tried once more. She explained that she had made a reservation, that she had confirmed it just yesterday, but the waiter barely reacted. His expression remained unmoved, his fingers gripping the edge of the counter as if this conversation was an inconvenience he had no patience for. Then came the words, the ones that sent a ripple through the air. People like you think you can just show up and get special treatment. This isn't that kind of place. The moment hung there, suspended between them. The sting of the words wasn't unfamiliar to Mrs. Rose, but hearing them in this restaurant, a place that had always felt like home, made it hurt in a way she hadn't expected. A hush fell over the nearby tables. The low murmur of voices faded. The tension in the room had shifted from subtle discomfort to something heavier, something that couldn't be ignored. Across the room, a woman leaned toward her companion, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's Mrs. Rose. She's been coming here for years." The whisper carried. One by one, heads turned, faces drawn into quiet concern, then confusion, then something sharper. Realization. But the young waiter still hadn't noticed. His arms remained crossed, his expression stubborn, unwilling to back down. He was too caught up in proving a point to see what was happening around him. And then, at last, Mrs. Rose spoke again. Her voice was gentle, but there was steel beneath it. Are you sure there is truly no place for me here? It was a simple question, but it was one that carried more weight than the young waiter could possibly understand. Still, he scoffed. He saw only what he wanted to see: an elderly woman standing alone, waiting for a table she wasn't going to get. But what he didn't see was the shift in the room, the way the other diners were no longer just watching, but reacting, the way the murmurs had turned into hushed outrage. And most importantly, he didn't see the man stepping out from the back, his eyes already scanning the room, his face dark with concern. The manager had heard everything, and suddenly the young waiter's world was about to change. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the kitchen. The restaurant manager, Patrick, emerged, his face lined with concern. He had been in this business long enough to know when something was wrong, and the sudden shift in the restaurant's energy told him that something was very wrong. His eyes scanned the room, quickly landing on Mrs. Rose. Recognition dawned instantly, and then, just as quickly, his gaze snapped to the young waiter. The tension in the room was thick now, the air heavy with unspoken words. Conversations had slowed to hushed whispers. Diners watched closely, some with quiet indignation, others with disbelief. Patrick wasted no time. "Mrs. Rose," he said, his voice firm yet apologetic as he stepped forward, "I am so sorry for this misunderstanding. Please allow me to find you a table immediately." The young waiter stiffened. His arms, once confidently crossed, slowly dropped to his sides. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Mrs. Rose simply inclined her head, her expression unreadable. Patrick turned sharply toward the waiter, his voice low but edged with authority. "What exactly is going on here?" The young waiter swallowed hard. His confidence from moments ago wavered. He hesitated, searching for an answer that wouldn't make him look as bad as he suddenly felt. But before he could speak, Patrick's eyes narrowed with realization. He had heard enough of the murmurs. He had seen the looks from the other customers. And worst of all, he had just dismissed one of their most valued patrons. A sinking feeling settled in his chest. Mrs. Rose could have spoken then, could have revealed the truth that would change everything in an instant. But she didn't. She wasn't interested in pulling rank. She was interested in something far more important. Instead, she simply met the young waiter's gaze and said, in a voice soft yet unwavering, "It's not about who I am. It's about how we treat each other, no matter who we are." For the first time, the young waiter truly looked at her, and for the first time, he felt the weight of what he had done. The silence between them stretched, thick with the understanding that this moment, this choice, would not be forgotten. Then, a sound, the scrape of a chair. A nearby diner stood up, stepping toward Mrs. Rose. Their voice was quiet but firm. "I'm sorry for what just happened. You didn't deserve that." A beat, then another voice. "Neither does anyone else." The moment shifted again. This time, it wasn't just an observation. It was solidarity, and the young waiter, standing there, knew that everything had changed. He had made a mistake that could never be undone. But the real question now was, what would happen next? The weight of the room had shifted entirely. The young waiter no longer held control of the moment. He had lost it, and now he felt it slipping further from his grasp. He swallowed, his palms sweaty. His mind raced, but there was no excuse he could give that would undo what had just happened. The murmur of voices grew louder. Patrons shook their heads, some still whispering, others looking toward Patrick, waiting for what would come next. Then, the restaurant's front door swung open. A tall man in a tailored suit strode in, his presence commanding. He didn't hesitate, didn't need to ask what was happening. He had already seen it. The video of the incident had been circulating online for the past hour, and now Victor Rose, the owner of the charming bistro, had arrived. The room fell into complete silence. The young waiter's face drained of color. He had never met the owner before, but in an instant he understood. Mrs. Rose wasn't just another customer. She was his mother. Victor's eyes swept the room before locking onto Patrick, then the young waiter. Can someone explain to me why my mother is standing here, subjected to this kind of disrespect? His voice was calm, controlled, but beneath it was something sharper, something unmistakably dangerous. The young waiter opened his mouth, but no words came. Patrick cleared his throat, his voice quiet but firm. Victor, No excuses, Victor interrupted, his tone unwavering. He turned to his mother, his expression softening slightly. Mom, are you all right? Mrs. Rose nodded gently, but her posture remained strong. I am now, but this is bigger than just me. Victor exhaled slowly, nodding in understanding. Then he turned back to the young waiter. Tell me, do you treat all our customers this way, or just the ones you think don't matter? The waiter's throat tightened. He looked down, unable to meet Victor's gaze. The silence stretched, the judgment heavy. Victor shook his head, his disappointment evident. I built this place on respect. My father and I worked for years to make it somewhere people felt welcomed, no matter who they were. And today my own mother was treated like she didn't belong. He let the words settle, let them sink in. Then finally, he spoke the words that would end it all. You're fired. The young waiter's breath caught. His head jerked up, his face pale. Sir, please, No. Victor's voice was final. I won't tolerate this, not in my restaurant. The weight of the decision crashed down. The young waiter knew there was nothing left to say. He had made his choice the moment he dismissed Mrs. Rose. Now he had to live with it. Slowly he turned and walked toward the door. He could feel the eyes of every person in the restaurant on him. He knew, even as he stepped outside, that this moment would follow him. The cameras had caught everything. The internet wouldn't let him forget. And as the door swung shut behind him, Victor turned back to the customers. Let me make something clear, he said, his voice carrying through the room. This is a place for everyone. Disrespect will never be tolerated here. Not now, not ever. The words hung in the air for a moment. Then, applause. A quiet, growing ripple of approval spread through the restaurant. The message had been sent, but Mrs. Rose knew. The real work was only just beginning. As the door swung shut behind the young waiter, the energy in the restaurant slowly shifted. Conversations resumed, but there was an undercurrent of something different now. Awareness, understanding, and a quiet sense of change. Victor turned back to his mother, his expression a mixture of apology and admiration. Mom, I'm so sorry this happened, he said softly. I thought we had built something better than this. Mrs. Rose gave him a small, knowing smile. She reached out and gently placed a hand on his arm. You have, Victor, but this shows us that the fight isn't over. It never really is. Victor sighed, nodding. He knew she was right. Across the room, a few staff members hesitantly stepped forward. One of them, a young woman named Clara, spoke up. We're with you, Mr. Rose. We don't want this kind of behavior here either. It doesn't reflect what this place stands for. Victor met her gaze and saw the sincerity in her eyes. Others around her nodded in agreement. He straightened his posture and looked around the restaurant. Then we do better, starting now. The murmurs quieted, the attention shifting back to him. From today on, all employees will go through training on respect, inclusion, and customer service. We will make sure that what happened today never happens again. A few patrons clapped quietly, showing their support. Others nodded in agreement, but Victor wasn't done. And more than that, he continued, we will be donating a portion of our profits to community programs that support equality and fight discrimination. If we say we stand for something, then we have to back it up with action. The applause grew louder. Mrs. Rose watched her son with quiet pride. This wasn't just about her anymore. It wasn't just about one bad waiter or one bad moment. It was about setting a new standard, about proving that respect wasn't just a word, it was a responsibility. Later that evening, when the restaurant had emptied and the lights had dimmed, Mrs. Rose and Victor sat together at a small table near the window. The day had been long, emotional, but it had also been important. Mrs. Rose sipped her tea, her eyes gazing out at the darkening sky. "You know, I never wanted to cause a scene," she said softly. Victor chuckled, shaking his head. "I know, Mom, but sometimes scenes need to be made." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw not just the man he had become, but the values she and his father had worked so hard to instill in him. She smiled. "Yes, sometimes they do." They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the day settling around them. But there was peace in it too, because today hadn't just been about a meal, or a table, or a single moment of disrespect. It had been about something bigger. A reminder, a lesson, a stand. And as Mrs. Rose took another sip of her tea, she knew this was just one more step in the long journey toward a better world. One meal, one moment, one act of courage at a time.